I was a board artist on Invincible Season 2, Season 3, and Season 4. Episodes for Season 4 are slowly coming out, and during my time on Invincible for 3 seasons, I picked up some valuable lessons for storyboarding that I will carry on for my future work, both professional and personal. And today I'd like to talk about those. Hey guys, it's Toniko Pantoja, and today I just want to talk about valuable lessons that I learned working on Invincible. Now, Season 4 just came out, and that was the last season that I was involved with. Ever since then, I've moved on to different projects and different experiences. But usually when a show or production wraps up and it comes out, I like to talk about the valuable lessons I learned working from those shows, and the big takeaways from those valuable lessons, and how it's changed my workflow for the better for future work, both personal and professional. I did a video talking about my experience working on Blue Eye Samurai and the valuable lessons I learned from that. If you guys want to check out that video, I'll put the link in the description below. And I need to tell you that in this video, I'm only going to talk about my experiences in the storyboarding department. I'm not going to talk about what goes on with design or animation or anything beyond that, because that was something that I was not involved with. I'm strictly just talking about storyboarding. So one valuable lesson that I kind of learned throughout my time on Invincible was the emphasis on economic and specific posing. And there's a bunch of stuff that I do want to talk about under this. First of all, one thing that I appreciated working on Invincible was that our storyboard supervisor actually encouraged us to not overly animate or overboard our storyboards and just think about really strong poses and drawings that can be held for a while. And I felt like this was kind of hard for me because I was so used to just constantly moving my characters when they act, especially in storyboards. And, there's nothing wrong with that, but I think for a show like this, it really tested me to sort of think about pushing my poses and just making it more specific. So instead of having 20 different panels in one shot, I could just have a few panels with some strong poses. So I would think about things like tilts or the contrapposto. I would angle the shoulder and hips to sort of show a bit more weight, and to make it less stiff, maybe parts of the bodies are facing different angles, like maybe the face is at a different angle compared to where the body or the torso is facing, just to make it feel a bit more asymmetric and organic, and maybe exaggerate some of those angles and some of those twists in the poses. Now, some may call this too comic booky, and it might not be the right sensibility for every show, but it actually allowed me to think more about my overall poses and how I can just make them more specific and stronger without overly doing so much more work. Like having one single panel that basically summarizes the whole shot is a really good skill to have, especially when you're trying to board a whole new sequence. Now, the next one is hookups, and this is something that a lot of us tend to forget, especially when you're in the heat of boarding and there's a lot of switching around panels and editing, and things just get chaotic throughout the process. Hookups are one of the most basic rules to keep in mind when storyboarding for animation, or just storyboarding in general, or in filmmaking in general. So the idea of the hookup is the consistent continuity between shots. So let's say in one shot a character points at something, and we cut in closer to that character, therefore making a new shot, and we want to make sure the poses and the overall action connect between shots, just so things are consistent and we follow continuity. Now, let's talk about an example without a hookup. So let's say, we go back to the same shot where the character points, we cut in closer, and the character is doing something completely different, which kind of breaks continuity. So after you board and you start shifting around panels or you start making edits, we do another pass where we just make sure that our hookups make sense. Storyboarding wise, I can't speak what happens with post-production or edit, but with storyboards, it's something that's ingrained in my future boarding process. Now, the next one I want to talk about is the general reuse of stuff. So first, I do want to talk about shots and storyboarding. And this is pretty useful if you just want to make the boarding process a lot more simplified and definitely easier to track when it comes to edit. So another way to think of it is approaching it as if you're in a live action set. You've only got let's say 2 to 3 or 4 master shots. And in those establishing master shots, you have variations of those shots that are more punched in or zoomed in to emphasize the emotion of the story. And sometimes this calls for something that's more simple in staging. So an example that I can show is my sequence with Anissa and Mark talking in the sky when Mark meets Anissa. My master shots for these are much more wide, and then my standard shots are just reusing those master shots and just punching in or zooming in some of those faces or changing the shot size. So I've learned to plan my master shots, and my overall shots are just different variations of those master shots. And the great thing about this is, let's say you need to paint backgrounds for these shots. You can just paint the backgrounds for the master shots and just reuse them for the standard shots or the shots where things are maybe punched in or zoomed in. Now, I do want to talk about the general reuse when it comes to, let's say, the drawings of the characters. Now, I really can't say what the decision is for this type of direction because I don't know if it's a creative decision or if it's a budget decision. It's out of my payroll, no pun intended. But for the hypothesis, let's say it's a bit of both. So, like in the previous point that I made earlier, instead of just coming up with many drawings just to have a character acting out a scene, I could just reuse some key poses within the same shot instead of having to come up with a new drawing every time. And it would still get the message across. Now, this is a really specific case, but it could also be how a vendor studio functions. So sometimes when the animation studio that's going to do the animation for the production, they look at the boards and they see it's way too animated. They don't really know how to translate that. And maybe they read the boards better when they're more economic or they reuse certain poses. Maybe it's because of quality control reasons. I don't know. But the valuable thing that I can tell you is that if you're storyboarding with certain limitations, whether it's budget or the schedule, and you just need to get the point across for a first pass, this is not a bad way to go. So the next one I want to talk about are the shorthands that we use on Invincible. And a shorthand is generally a rough drawing or a visual representation of what the characters might look like on screen without the details. Now, when it comes to TV animation or even action shows, proportion is number one priority to make sure things stay on model. Next would be things like expressions, faces, and then eventually things like the shapes of their accessories and costumes. Proportion first, so making sure the size measurements of the character's body features are closer to the model, but also the characters in proportion to each other. Usually when I do thumbnails, things are off proportion, and one thing that I did previously is that I would just take my really rough thumbnails and just try to clean up the drawing from there. But the issue with that is sometimes the proportions are off, sometimes characters that are supposed to be vastly different from each other in terms of size, they're the same after I try to clean up my thumbnails. But not only that, the perspective is sometimes off. So after my thumbnail pass, I actually do another thumbnail pass where I'm pretty much just making sure the thumbnails that I have are more in proportion and have more of a grounded perspective. And perspective is an amazing tool that you can use to figure out proportions of your characters and how they sort of relate to each other throughout the whole set. I did a whole video on this that I'll link in the description. In feature animation, they're a lot more forgiving when it comes to this, but when it comes to TV, especially when you're sending out boards that a lot of overseas studios might actually use as layout and production boards, those boards must be tight in terms of proportion and perspective. I think another thing that I was told that I needed to work on was my line economy. Now, the boards that you're seeing in this video, you can tell that my lines are very scratchy, there's a lot of line mileage, it's just very messy. Because the way I worked on Blue Eye Samurai, which was the previous production I was on, I treated my boards more like painterly illustration, like brushing out big blotches of shapes and then using the eraser to wedge things out. But it was encouraged to do something different for a show like Invincible. And from what I've been told, it was difficult for revisionists to make small changes. Also, it just made the drawing look a bit unclear, like you weren't really sure where things were connected or where things were conformed. So since then, I've been focused on having more economic lines, like less scratchy lines, just quick, decisive lines, and then just let it go. And having cleaner and clearer shapes. So when I think about these notes and looking back, I think the advice or sort of the feedback that I got from my supervisors was that I'm spending way too much energy on doing laborious stuff that doesn't need to be labored and put that energy in making stronger economic choices and having the foundation of that shot solid. And look, while Invincible might not be a show that best represents what I do as a creative, and why I might not seem like the right fit for a show like Invincible, I think there's a lot of valuable lessons that are good for anyone interested in storyboarding, to here, especially with what we see online as storyboards. I think at the end of the day, it's what the show prioritizes. I'm in the favor of being more economic and having stronger choices, more so than just animating the whole thing. If you're thinking about things like spacing and the mechanics and the slow ins and slow outs in storyboards, then how is that not just animation? But I'm someone who does have an animation background, so I do think it's a bit hypocritical of me to say that animated storyboards are bad, because I personally love sneaking them in. I love having a sense of that stuff. I love those little nuances, but even I can say that's beyond storyboarding. And the thing that I can respect about my time working on Invincible is that it showed a lot of the weaknesses I had, where I just relied having a lot of really laborious looking stuff and not just issues that could be solved with simpler solutions. Anyways, that's all I want to say. Bye. Interested in learning hand-drawn animation or learning how to finish an animated shot from beginning to end? Have a look at the store where you'll find the complete Introduction to 2D Animation video course, tutorials, and other resources. Learn classical animation approaches, drawing, lectures, techniques, and other process videos. Visit the store through the link in the description below.